Zayd Ayers Dohrn grew up with parents in the Weather Underground. He explores that legacy in a podcast and a new memoir. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Back in 2002, the documentary The Weather Underground profiled members of the 1970s clandestine group labeled by the FBI as domestic terrorists. The film won an Academy Award and remains a vivid and nuanced account. Now comes a fresh angle on this history from the author Zayd Ayers Dohrn. He produced the 8-episode podcast Mother Country Radicals, and he's just published a new memoir titled Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, A Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground. Zayd's parents, Bernadine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, were key leaders of the Weather Underground. Their politics were forged by the Civil Rights Movement and radicalized by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Hampton. The Weather Underground was inspired by armed resistance groups such as the Black Panthers and its offshoot, the Black Liberation Army. As white radicals, the Weather Underground had an advantage. They could purchase guns or walk into government buildings to plant bombs without being racially profiled. The Weather Underground ultimately claimed responsibility for over 24 bombings in high-profile sites, including a New York police station, the U.S. Capitol, and the Pentagon. They focused on destroying property, not taking lives, by setting off bombs at night and calling in warnings. The only people killed by their bombs were 3 of their own members from an accidental explosion in 1970. Zayd was born in 1977, while his parents were still living with false identities. His parents told him they were like the rebels in Star Wars, fighting an evil empire. They finally surrendered to U.S. authorities in 1980, but avoided prosecution because the FBI had broken so many laws in trying to catch them. For his podcast and memoir, Zayd interviewed his parents and their associates to explore a complicated legacy. One of his themes is how these revolutionaries took risks while also raising children. Zayd has a career as a playwright, but he stayed away from his parents' story for many years. It was during the pandemic when he realized that their generation was getting older. If he had questions, this was the time to ask. That set him on the path for his podcast and now his memoir. I reached him at his home in Chicago. Our conversation begins with the 1975 documentary Underground. The director, Emile D'Antonio, filmed with Bernadine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, and others while they were still fugitives. This was a couple years before Zayd was born. I asked what he sees when he watches that film.
I think what we're seeing in that film is we're capturing a very interesting moment, which is they are literally in front of his cameras when they learn that the Vietnam War has ended. And so you're seeing young people who have spent the better part of their adult lives fighting with everything they have to end the Vietnam War, and they're hearing that that has finally happened. Of course, not that they personally were responsible for the end of the war, but just that this dream that they've had, not just to end the war, but to end with a Viet Cong victory and the humiliation of the United States imperialist government, it was a kind of a dream come true for them. So you can hear them celebrating, you can hear them getting excited, and I think what's fascinating is you can hear them realizing that the motive force that has kept their organization and themselves going for the last several years is suddenly gone. Like, who are they if not anti-war activists, and what are they going to do now?
And so I'm curious, when did you first see that film, and what did you make of it? Not all of us have a chance to see a film of our parents before we were born.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've probably seen bits of it my whole life, and I remember as a kid kind of being interested that there was a film of my parents as young people, and kind of watching a second of it just to see, oh, that's what they looked like, and then kind of getting bored of all the talking and turning it off. And then I can remember later as a college student watching it and thinking it's such an interesting time capsule of, capturing these people in their youth, in their sort of moment of revolutionary activism and idealism. And then, of course, I watched it several more times when I worked on my book, just to kind of try to understand that moment in time and what I could glean from the way they talked about themselves in that film.
And did your perception of it change over time between like when you were watching it in your 20s versus watching it in your 40s?
I mean, I guess for me, it's when I first watched it, it was sort of the only documentary evidence of my parents at that time. You know, the only like moving pictures I had seen of them. So it felt like a really valuable artifact, and it felt like, in a way, the only sort of comprehensive media portrayal I had seen. I guess as I grew older and as I started to do some of the research myself, it feels much less comprehensive and much more just like a snapshot of a moment, and leaving out a lot of context that I think is quite important now.
So I want to ask you about another major documentary work about the Weather Underground, and that is the film by Sam Green and Bill Siegel that came out in 2002, was nominated for an Academy Award. I guess you would have been in your mid-20s when that film came out, and I think it was coming out at a time when a collective memory of the Weather Underground had faded and kind of crystallized into different biases or romanticizations of it. And so I wonder how you experienced that film kind of reopening a conversation about that history.
Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, I would say Sam and Bill are quite good filmmakers, and it's a compelling watch. And so I found it interesting as a young person to see a documentary film about my own parents, about their friends, and it was the first one I had seen where it was both them in their present day selves, the way I knew them as talking heads, kind of reflecting on that time, and also, of course, intercut with archival footage and so on of them as young people. I mean, the first film you talked about, the Emile D'Antonio one, is, it's all talking heads, but it's talking heads in that moment of people in their 20s and early 30s. So the Bill and Sam film was the first time I had seen that kind of treatment of like, this is what they were and what they looked like and how they spoke when they were young, and this is them as older people reflecting back on it. So that was quite interesting for me to kind of follow that trajectory and to get to see in one film that arc of my parents' lives.
I'm curious, do you feel like you were learning new things from that film, or was it a kind of different take on a history that you basically knew?
Yeah, I think it was a take on history I basically knew. I mean, it's funny when you're doing that kind of like hour and a half feature length documentary. I don't say this as a criticism, but it's kind of, you're gliding over a lot of stuff, and you're really doing the greatest hits. And so those were things I knew. They were stories I knew. They were criticisms I knew. But it was interesting to see it all put together in one piece, in one package, and to see my family's kind of past life treated as sort of worthy of documentary and historical study.
I'm glad you say that about what any documentary naturally has to do to condense a story into a manageable form. You're making choices about what to leave in, what to leave out. I think inevitably, as a consumer of a film, you maybe forget about the things that are left out. And so I think by the time your podcast came out, I had like a sense of myself that like, oh, I know a lot about that history. I've seen these movies and I've read other pieces along the way, and that to me was a revelation about both your podcast and then your book, that I had more to learn. Maybe not, crucial things to learn, but there's a lot of nuance and detail that gets filled in. So you're a storyteller. You write plays, and I've heard you say that for a long time you weren't kind of touching this material directly. I think if I understand the timeline right, it was around the time the pandemic that you started to think about this generation getting older, and if you're going to ask them questions, now is the time to ask more questions. Can you elaborate on what your motives were at the time, and if there was a kind of conscious thinking like, well, I haven't touched this material before as a storyteller, and now I'm going to?
Yeah. Well, as you say, I've always thought of myself as a storyteller, and I've been a professional writer for 15 years without ever thinking about really touching my family's story. And that was partly because I just didn't know that I had the distance to handle it in a way that I would find interesting. And also partly because, as you said, I felt like even on the inside of my family, I felt like, okay, this story has been done a bunch of times. It's been done as documentary. It's been done as feature film. It's been done as tons of books and memoirs.
Your father
and so
wrote
on.
his own memoir.
My father wrote his memoir. Mark Rudd wrote a memoir. Kathy Wilkerson wrote a memoir. And of course, the documentary films and even the feature films like Running on Empty and The Company You Keep and such that were inspired by this story. So I don't know. I stayed away from it for all sorts of reasons, and probably there's a Freudian explanation under it all of like not wanting to dig up those skeletons, But yes, what happened is the pandemic changed my thinking in a couple ways. First of all, it shut down all my theater and TV projects, and so I was suddenly a writer at loose ends. And it also had that effect. I mean, I'm sure you remember how isolating it was and how scary, especially for those of us who had elderly relatives. And my mother had just turned 80, and I had a real sense during the pandemic of like, I'm not sure if I'm going to see her again. And that was a feeling I hadn't had before. I also had my own kids by then, and I was kind of interested suddenly in that question of how do I explain our family history to my children. So I started kind of having Zoom calls like this one and recording them with my parents and asking them questions about their past. And I really started it as kind of more in the mode of a family archivist, not as thinking it would turn into a public project. I just thought I should get their voices down while I can and kind of ask them some questions while I can. And then I pretty quickly discovered that I thought I kind of had hit a gold mine, that there was something really important here. Certainly more detail and nuance than some of the other projects that are out there, the other documentaries and stuff that are out there. But I actually did think there were some kind of crucial things missing from the narrative, both personal things and historical things.
Can you give some examples of what stood out
Yeah,
there?
one very obvious big one is that all the projects we've talked about so far, certainly the two feature documentaries about the Weather Underground, and really most of the books as well, both by insiders and outsiders, really treat the group as an anti-Vietnam War group, first and foremost. And I think one thing that I realized pretty quickly, especially talking to my mom, and keep in mind, my mom is one of the few of those people who never wrote a memoir, never told her story publicly, even though she was in many ways the most prominent leader in the group. I realized quickly talking to her that her politics, her journey towards radicalization, and her entire worldview has at least as much, if not more, to do with race and anti-racism as it does with anti-war activism. Her journey to radicalization and revolution was all about these steps of, joining the civil rights movement, following Dr. King, marching behind Dr. King in rallies, and then watching him be murdered. Then joining SDS, forming an alliance with Fred Hampton and the Illinois Black Panthers, and watching him be murdered. Forming an alliance with Eldridge Cleaver and the New York Black Panthers, and watching the Panthers be framed in the Panther 21 case and then driven into the underground and into exile. So it was just kind of fascinating to me that there's been all these histories of the Panthers, many written by great Black scholars and historians of the Black movement, many histories of the Weather Underground, but generally through that lens of boomer nostalgia for the anti-war movement. Both pro and con, some books and documentaries and stuff skewering the Weather Underground for their sins against the anti-war movement, some more positive, but almost always separating the white and the Black struggle during that period. So I did feel like there was something really important I could add to that historical conversation, which was the fundamentally central place of Black-white solidarity in the Black freedom struggle that the Weather Underground really represented at the time.
Yeah, and I think that is something that really stands out in these works that was highlighted in a more impactful way to me than I had seen before. So you started out as thinking this is a family archive. I don't know at what point it became more of a journalistic memoir project, but I wonder if either of those formats gave you an ability to probe in a way that you hadn't before, just in dinner table conversations.
Absolutely, an opportunity and a kind of a purpose and a drive. I mean, one of the funny things is, when you're a kid or even a young adult and you're talking to your parents, you might ask them questions in a vague, sort of purposeless way, and you're kind of curious about your upbringing, your background, but you're not really sitting down for hard-hitting 3-hour interviews. That's just not something you do around the dinner table usually. I mean, my dinner table is an unusual dinner table, and we do have intense political conversations and stuff. But yeah, it was really, I started as a family archive, and then two things happened. One was I got approached by Crooked Media asking me if I was interested in a kind of an audio treatment of my family story. I mean, I had talked to some people about the fact that I was doing these interviews, and it kind of came back around that way. But the second thing was, once I had interviewed my parents a bunch, I realized that there were all these other people out there, some of whom were old and some of them whom were quite sick. And I just started thinking, if it's an archive project, it's bigger than a family archive. It's like, I need to talk to Kathy Boudin, who had stage 4 cancer at the time and was an important figure in the Weather Underground and certainly an important person in my family life. Or Sekou Odinga, who was the military leader of the Black Liberation Army in Harlem and helped break Assata Shakur out of prison. He was sick and old as I was doing this project, and I thought, like, I'm somebody who could actually get him to talk. Not, a lot of these people have not talked to anybody, and my status as a kind of a quasi insider allowed me a certain access to people, and I thought I should use that if it can be helpful to preserving some of these voices. So once I started interviewing people like that, I realized, like, it's a bigger project than a family archive. It's some kind of documentary history that I'm going to have to try to, like, wrangle into a narrative form and make public in some way. So it was a process. It was a multi-stage process of trying to win myself over to the idea that I should actually devote a couple years of my life to this.
So there is a lot of natural secrecy in these worlds about the things that took place, illegal activities that took place in the 1970s, a code of silence amongst revolutionaries. You acknowledge there, some details your own parents won't answer for you because that code is meaningful to them. I wonder if there are any examples of you trying to delve into some of this history where maybe you initially met with some resistance and were able to overcome that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a couple of funny examples. The one thing about these interviews is that there's this sort of dual-sided nature to my access in these cases, because on the one hand, these people I'm talking to, my parents, but really most of the members of the underground, trust me more than they would trust an outsider or a journalist, historian. But it also means that there's a certain burden of care around there, certain things that they can't or won't talk about because they might implicate people in crimes. There's certain secrets that they have promised that they would take to the grave. And so we had to kind of try to build some ground rules around, the basic terms of our agreement were, I said, you have to tell me the truth. You can't deceive me about any of these things. But if there's something that comes up that you feel like you can't talk about, you can tell me that, and I will respect that and try to find other ways to find out what I need to know. I think my parents only took advantage of that privilege maybe twice, and in the 5 years that I interviewed them. And both times were instances where they didn't want to talk about an action, a crime committed by somebody other than them, and they didn't want to potentially implicate anybody in those crimes. But I'll give you one concrete example, is that, I had always, and this kind of is a fundamental thread in my book, I'd always been told growing up that my parents' active revolutionary activism ended when I was born. And that was just something that they told me early on. Once we had you became the center of our world, and we decided to try to start thinking about turning ourselves in, even though we were fugitives and so on. And they never lied to me about it. They just explained that like I had become their priority, and that they started thinking about turning themselves in. And that was how I understood my early years. And so it was only when I started working on the book and I started trying to literally rebuild a roadmap of the underground. I had this old atlas that we had used, this 1977 Rand McNally Road Atlas. And I was literally highlighting on the road maps, like, here's where we went here, we went to California, we went to, and I remembered this trip we had taken to West Virginia to a town called Alderson. We'd spent some time camping there. And I had always just remembered it as my first camping trip, learning to put up a tent and things like that. And it was looking at the atlas that I realized that camping site in Alderson was just half a mile away from this federal prison where Assata Shakur was being held. And so I went back to my parents and I said, this cannot be a coincidence that we camped, this close as a family to the prison where one of your allies and comrades from the Black Liberation Army was being held. And then my dad admitted that indeed we had been there on the request of the Black Liberation Army to take photographs of the prison and try to figure out a way to help Assata get out. So that was an instance of they didn't exactly deceive me, but there was an omission about something important that had happened, and I was able to track it down, as a historian, as a journalist. And when I went back to them, they confirmed, that what I was seeing, and then that led to further conversations and exposing a whole other side of my childhood that I just really hadn't known existed.
That moment in the book does resonate strongly, and there's an emotional quality to you telling it. In fact, I listened to you read the book on audiobook, so yeah. So I think it comes across even more distinctly. Can you elaborate on, how you received that kind of shift in understanding about your childhood?
Yeah, well, it really was a kind of an interesting shift in my worldview. And I don't want to overstate it. I on some level, I always knew that my parents were so committed to this cause and to their comrades in the Black Underground and to the fight against racism and so on, that they were willing to sacrifice a lot, to sacrifice themselves, their futures. But it was a moment of realizing, I was not really their first priority, or at least their priority, their sense of what was important in the world was deeply divided when I was a kid. And, I think for any kid, that's an unsettling idea that your parents have commitments that precede you and maybe supersede you in the world, that there are things that they might choose over you, is a disturbing idea for a child. I think as an adult now, I'm better equipped to understand it and it shifts some of my understanding of my parents in the sense that it makes me realize they were willing to take risks that were existential to me and my brother at the time. But in a way, it just confirms what I've always known about them, which is that their commitments to that cause are all-consuming, and that for them, the idea of building what they saw as a better future, fighting racism, taking down the American government, building a revolutionary movement, those were ways to make a better future. Having kids was a way to make a better future. And for them, the two things were not separable. They thought of themselves as people who had to change the world in order to build a better world for their kids.
So you make the podcast, Mother Country Radicals, and from the outside, it might have felt like, okay, you've put this chapter in perspective for yourself. It
felt that way from the inside too. Yeah,
it was a big undertaking of storytelling. So, when and how did you realize that there was something more there that you wanted to explore in a memoir?
Yeah. I very much thought I was done with that project. It was, 10 episodes, almost 8 hours of audio, a lot of, 2 years of work. And I thought I'd said what I wanted to say about my family history. I think two things happened. One was I had filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FBI when I started working on the podcast in 2019 or something. I hired a lawyer. We filed the request. We got back a letter saying, the request was for all the files you have on Bernadine Dohrn, on my mom. And we got back a letter from the FBI basically saying, we have 2,800 boxes of files on this person, and if you want us to process all of them, it's going to take until 2035, and it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars, and it's not possible to do in any kind of reasonable way. So we appealed, we filed a lawsuit, we tried to do all the things you would do to pry the documents loose, but it didn't work in the sense that by the time the podcast was ready to go, we still didn't have the FBI files. But in one of those terrible ironies of being a historian, as soon as the podcast came out, we got a thumb drive in the mail from the FBI with 7,000 newly declassified documents about my mom. And they were quite fascinating and revealing. They had transcripts of interviews with my grandparents, her parents, down in their retirement community in Sun City, Florida. They had, sightings of my mom supposedly from informants all over the country. And it was just really interesting material that I hadn't gotten to include in the podcast. So that was one thing that happened. But in a way, the more important thing that happened was that all the people who listened to the podcast, many of those people were people connected to the story, and people started to reach out to me and say, I wasn't willing to talk before, but now I'm willing to, or, somebody has died and therefore I'm now able to tell you a story that I couldn't have told you before. And some of those were really central and important things. Kathy Boudin had died right as the podcast was coming out. So some of her friends and comrades were willing to talk on the record in more detail about some of the things she'd been involved in. And I got, all of a sudden, just kind of out of the blue, a cardboard box in the mail containing hundreds of letters my mother had written when I was a baby, when we were underground, back to a friend of hers in California. And they really gave some insight into her inner life and her internal struggle that I had just never understood before. And it was kind of like a time machine, a time capsule, giving me access to her younger self. And I thought, there's enough here to make a book that is not just what the podcast did, but tells a deeper, more personal history of that time and of our family.
You talk about some of the secrets that you may never be answered, and some of them don't feel that meaningful to know, who went on what mission in the early 70s. But I wonder if there are any questions that you have that loom larger that you don't feel like you fully got an answer to.
I mean, I'm sure there are things that I don't know everything about, but I feel satisfied that I have dug into every shadowy corner that I could see, and that I know what was going on and who was involved in what, and how it went down and why people did the things they did. And so, as a writer, not just a historian or journalist, but as a whatever I am, I'm a playwright by training, but I think of the book as novelistic in its aspirations. And what I mean by that is it's meant to be a page turner and a fascinating story. But more importantly than that, it's meant to bring us close enough to these people that we feel like we can understand them as human beings, as motivated by emotions and drives that we might recognize in ourselves. And so for me, that was like the end goal of the project was, can I figure out enough so that I can tell this story with enough intimacy and enough conviction and enough truth that people will be able to understand this journey and see why they did the things they did. And so that's what I tried to do. And I don't think there's any secrets out there that would change the fundamental nature of those stories, or that would change my opinion of my parents or other people's opinions of them.
It seems like in the making of this that you were bumping up against some different emotional perspectives, inside your family, changing way of how you saw parts of your childhood, ways in which your parents might have their own explanations for that. What was that like, trying to shape your narrative of something that your parents lived through and claiming your own perspective on it, particularly in moments where they might hold a different shading of perspective?
I think it was, it was definitely something. It was just a long-term negotiation and navigation of where I felt like I needed to go, where they felt what they could offer me, and I guess I would say overall, I feel like for me it was an attempt to understand the family that preceded me and then the world I was born into. And I will say, I think my parents really were incredibly generous with the idea that like I was going to tell my story, and my story involves their stories, and it requires me to understand their stories, but that fundamentally any kid, any person, it's sort of part of our birthright to know where we came from and know what that means for our past and present and future. So anyway, I always framed it that way for them and for myself, that it was about understanding them so I could understand myself, so I could pass something along to my children. And I think we were all on board with that project. And so that was like a way of navigating through the difficulties of interrogation and disclosure in a family, because we all shared the end goal, which was, making sense of this story in a way that was useful to the next generation.
Earlier, you were touching upon a larger theme in the book, which is, I would describe as divided loyalties that one can have as a parent versus their life's passion. And in your case, your parents' life passion was revolutionary work. There are plenty of other memoirs or biographies where you see people looking at their parents' lives and their passion might have been art or money or fame. Other things that kind of took these parents away from
alcohol,
their kids' lives. Yeah, narcissism.
Exactly.
The list goes on. And I'm curious about this theme. I mean, as the parent of a 16-year-old, I think I struggled with this in my own life. That often the job of parenting to show up at soccer games and kids plays or is not as compelling as whatever your life's passion is. And first of all, I wonder if you have found corollaries in in biographies or memoirs of people who have nothing to do with revolutionary politics but have a kind of similar processing of their childhood.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say I think it's a primal experience for everybody to realize that their parents, we all have this like oneness and separateness journey when we begin by thinking our mother is just a part of us, or we are the same being, and then realizing, oh, she has her own life, her own attachments, her own thoughts, her own desires, and that's a kind of a strange and primal realization that I think is really fundamental to the construction of identity, right? It's like literally that moment of realizing, oh, I am separate from my parents, is the moment we come to see ourselves as a coherent individual with our own identities. So yeah, I would say it's primal, it's fundamental, and it's universal. One thing that's been fascinating about releasing the podcast and the book is I've gotten endless emails from people, some of whom are literally the children of revolutionaries, the children of IRA soldiers or Iranian revolutionaries or, underground South African ANC members or whatever it is, who say, like, I recognize myself in your story. But as you say, Tom, like, I've also gotten tons of emails from people who say something to the effect of, my parents were not revolutionaries, they were nothing like your parents, but they were committed to X. And that's been part of the struggle of my life is, why was my father always traveling around to art fairs around the country and dragging us along with him? And what did that mean? Or, whatever that story is. So I see corollaries everywhere. I think in a way, every family has to have some story of the kids realizing that their parents have these other lives. And sometimes it's a shattering, traumatic story where it's like, I realized my father had another family or something like that. But sometimes it's just like having to reconcile with the fact that your parents are themselves flawed, eccentric, strange, obsessive people with their own goals and dreams and aspirations that are alongside their love of you, but not necessarily the same as their love of you. So yes, and I would just to close say that, like, in my own parenting, I see it all the time. I mean, my children are the center of my life and my hopes for the future, and it's like, how do you balance that with being a writer and with having a job and with doing the things that you really care about? It's always a balance.
As I wrap this up, I want to ask you about the legacy of the Weather Underground. I mean, many historians of the 1960s will look back at this time in 1969 when the Students for a Democratic Society splintered, and the Weathermen, as they were called then, took it in this more radical direction, and some people would argue diminished an opportunity to have for this other kind of coalition building that they think SDS represented. And so when we look back on that 1970s era of revolutionaries who, were enamored of a spirit of Che Guevara and felt that bombing things, even without putting human lives in danger, were the way to make meaningful change. How do you look back on that era, and and what do you think the balance sheet is on that effort?
Yeah, well, I could write a whole book about it, and I have, but I think I think my first answer is I look back on it. Of course, I wasn't alive during that time, but I look back on it with a certain amount of ambivalence. Certainly, I don't necessarily agree. I mean, as you say, there are historians and members of the movement like Todd Getland, Mark Rudd, who have written extensively about how 1969 and the founding of Weathermen represented this kind of cataclysmic end to the peace movement and was deeply destructive to the anti-war cause. I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I think the anti-war movement had been going on for years and years at that point. I think one thing people forget is my mom, for example, had spent the better part of her adult life in the 1960s part of peaceful organizations fighting to mobilize to end the war. Voter registration drives, sit-ins, demonstrations, protests, being arrested in acts of civil disobedience, all those things. Likewise with the civil rights movement, Dr. King and all these people had spent endless blood, sweat, and tears and years of effort trying to change this country through nonviolent means. And they were met not only with a Vietnam War that was escalating, with government violence that was escalating, the murders of black leaders all over the country. And so I think the whole movement was splintering, not just SDS. The Black Panthers were splintering. Dr. King's coalition was splintering. And I think you can see it in what's happening today. You think about progressive politics and the bitter fights over, like, is this person taking it too far? And that's going to lead to a fracturing of the Democratic coalition, and we all need to stand together. I mean, I'm all for standing together. I'm for building a mass movement, but I don't think we can paper over I think people who consider themselves centrists like to pretend that if the radicals would just be quiet and get under the centrist tent, we could all proceed in a more productive direction. And I don't think that that's either realistic to human nature, nor do I think the historical record supports that. I mean, SDS was a great organization and did a lot of good, but it had not stopped the Vietnam War. And so what was happening in 1969 was not just a couple of radicals deciding for their own narcissistic reasons to split the movement. It was a schism driven by these deep questions of how far should we go, how hard should we push, how patient can we be, and should we as white activists continue to organize in white spaces, or should we pursue a fundamental strategy of solidarity with the Black freedom movement, and in particular with the Black Panther Party? So anyway, this is a long answer, but all this to say, I would say that I look back and I think a movement for justice has to proceed on multiple fronts. It has to proceed as a mass movement, and there are always going to be radicals on the margins who are trying to push for faster, less incremental change. And I think getting that balance right is very difficult. But you look at the movements that the Weathermen were trying to emulate, and I'm thinking not just of Cuba and Algeria, but, you know, the ANC in South Africa. And it's like, it's not as simple as saying it's either the peaceful mass movement or the violent radicals. You know, Nelson Mandela was both. He was a violent radical fighting for change under apartheid. And then when the movement had shifted to a place where democratic participation was possible, he was an avatar of peace and democracy and reconciliation. And I think all those things are important, and we should all be struggling in our own way to, you know, to make the world a better place.
And when you look at some of the currents today, does anything stand out to you as an obvious lesson that maybe should be taken from this history that you've immersed yourself in?
Yeah, well, one thing we just were talking about, which is the factionalism as a longtime Achilles heel of the left. There has always been this tendency since the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and probably well before, towards saying like leftist movements are acting as though their ideological line is the only ideological line, and sort of giving purity tests and saying, if you don't agree with every part of our agenda, then you are on the outside of what we're doing. And I do think the Weathermen bear some responsibility for that sense of like self-righteousness and ideological purity tests that split the movement in various ways. I think it was also coming from progressive labor and other places as well. But I certainly think if progressive movements need a lesson today, one lesson is we have more in common than our differences, and acting as though if people don't agree with you, they are no longer part of your cause is a deeply self-destructive act. So that's one lesson. And the other lesson is more of a cautionary tale, but I do worry, here we are in 2026, 10 years after Trump's first election, and for 10 years, people have been protesting in every way they could think of, and it often feels to a lot of people, particularly young people, like we're not making progress, right? My daughters, this is all they've ever known of America. It's their entire experience. And I think that's super dangerous, because I do, in my history of my family, what I realized is, you know, my parents fought for 10 years and throughout the entire 1960s in every way they could think of to fight racism, to fight the Vietnam War. And not only did it not work, it felt like everything was getting worse. And that's what really caused the turn towards a darker, more violent movement in the 1970s.
I want to thank Zayd Ayers Dohrn for speaking with me. His podcast is Mother Country Radicals, and his memoir is titled Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young: A Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground. Thanks to our team: series producer Hannah Nordenswan, Doc Voices editor Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.